Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining Mayer Brown's Global Financial Markets Teleconference Series. Today's call is entitled President Biden's Impact on US-Sino Relationships. My name is Duncan Abate, and I'm a partner in our Hong Kong office. I also have the honor of serving on Mayer Brown's Global Management Committee. Before we start in earnest, I've got just a couple of housekeeping items. As regular listeners will know, this call is being recorded. We'll be emailing an audio link to all participants should you wish to listen to the conference again or forward it to your colleagues. In addition, the recording will also be available as a podcast on any of your preferred podcast platforms. Since we do not have a Q&A session, if you do have any questions, then please feel free to send them by email to the email address gfm@mayerbrown.com. That's G, F for Freddie, M for Mayer, @mayerbrown.com, and we'll respond as promptly as we can. This is actually the same email address as is on your invitation email. So joining me today are two Mayer Brown partners, Thomas So and Tamer Soliman. Thomas is a partner with me in our Hong Kong office, and Thomas advises on all types of cross-border China-related disputes as well as regulatory-related investigation matters in mainland China. He represents banks and financial institutions, property developers and corporations, as well as mainland China enterprises on securities and equity-related disputes. Tamer Soliman is a partner in our Washington, D.C. and Dubai offices. Tamer's our global head of the firm's export control and sanctions practice. He advises corporates and governments on a wide range of international trade issues governing cross-border investments, joint ventures, sales, manufacturing, and the development of emerging technologies. Now, with that brief introduction, we'll now crack on to today's discussion. And let me just start, if I may, by setting the scene. Well, there's been a tumultuous last couple of years, to say the least, for relations between the US and China. It was characterized by the introduction in the US of the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which is in November a couple of years ago. And then more recently, just a year ago, the introduction of Hong Kong's national security law, which has sparked much debate. Throughout this period, there's been a seemingly constant backwards and forwards in relation to trade sanctions, allegations of human rights violations, and general political rhetoric. Perhaps the nadir of the deliberations involved the TikTok fiasco last year, which eventually died down and settled into absolutely nothing, but whilst it was ongoing, it's front page of most newspapers. So where does this all leave us now? Well, we've had a change of the US administration, a move away possibly from governance by Twitter, and a return perhaps to some semblance of normality in diplomatic relations. But has anything really changed? It does seem that whilst President Biden has not materially increased the pressure on China, he most certainly is not reducing any pressure. Just last weekend, literally, the US announced sanctions on a further 23 companies relating to alleged human rights violations in Xinjiang. And China, most notably President Xi's speech on the 100th anniversary of the CCP, is bullish to say the very least. China has very recently passed anti-sanctions legislation itself, which is designed to counter the impact of the various sanctions laws being imposed on China, primarily by Western administrations. But what does this mean for our clients? Will it force our clients to pick a side? Do they need to either go to the blue corner or the red corner? Is there a pathway that they can pick through the maze without being penalized either by one side or, in the worst possible scenario, by both? With Thomas and Tamer, we are very fortunate to have with us two partners who are steeped in knowledge of this fascinating and difficult issue. So without further ado, let's get an insight into where we think the US-China relationship really is, and perhaps more interestingly, where we think it's going. So Tamer, why don't we start with you? President Biden has now been in office for nearly 6 months. Tell us what's changed in reality.
Thank you, Duncan. I think with the incoming Biden administration, there was a lot of perhaps hopeful speculation that the Biden administration might be different than the Trump administration as regards U.S.-China relations. But as the past few months have shown, while the personality and approach are very different, the underlying policy and enforcement priorities are very much aligned with the prior administration. And in fact, those are really an outgrowth of policy concerns that have been long-standing within Washington. The key policy drivers in the current administration are essentially to counter U.S. foreign adversaries, and key among them China, and bolster American technological competitiveness. One of the things I think we saw in the past few years was a willingness by the Trump administration to use long-standing national security and foreign policy tools against major state-owned and state-affiliated enterprises in China that were viewed or determined as raising serious national security concerns for the United States. I think we have seen in the past few months the same willingness to use those tools against very important economic actors in China. What we will see is some effort to rationalize or bring order back to the use of those tools. So, Duncan, you mentioned the TikTok episode. That's a good example of that, where we see the Biden administration trying to rein in how those tools were used. But fundamentally, I think the Biden administration has made clear that it has some of the same concerns about that app and about tools for big data collection and what they may mean for U.S. national security interests. So I think we'll see the Biden administration trying to impose some order on how those tools were used and ensure that we don't see as much in the way of unintended consequences, because these are inherently very powerful legal tools, but still with the same significant potential implications for markets when they are used. Some of the early signals we've seen from the White House and key cabinet secretaries in terms of what may be around the corner, heavy enforcement of entity list and sanctions restrictions, so continued use of those tools. And as you mentioned, Duncan, just over the past few days, we saw, again, another round of designations of significant Chinese entities relating to human rights issues, further application of those laws in some instances in an extraterritorial way, more aggressive efforts to identify emerging and foundational technologies, so new technologies that are perhaps not yet controlled on U.S. export control lists or multilateral export control lists. We'll see, and we've seen the Commerce Secretary, for example, make several references to a continued and aggressive push in that space. We're seeing in the United States an expansive new technology supply chain regime, something like the CFIUS framework, but picking up where CFIUS left off. So a national security review framework that is not necessarily limited to investments and is really more focused on supply procurement of technologies that could impact U.S. critical infrastructure, U.S. large collection of data, and other national security concerns. A key focus on human rights and forced labor issues. And here we'll see the Biden administration trying to take a coordinated approach across agencies using a combination of sanctions designations, export control restrictions, and import restrictions. And that was certainly a feature of the designations that occurred a few days ago. Increased enforcement staff and resources. So again, if we looked at what's happening within the Commerce Department, what's happening within some of these agencies, They're seeking additional tools. They're seeking additional staff to focus on enforcement of these areas. And then finally, we'll see an increased multilateral approach, and that's probably a key distinction between the past administration and this administration. We'll see the Biden administration looking to looking more to the EU, looking more to Asian partners, where possible, to take a multilateral approach. And I think that highlights a key point here, which is that it's not just the Biden administration that dictates what's happening here. Congress will play a key role. Our partners will play a key role. And importantly, China will play a key role. How China reacts in this space and what actions it takes are really going to impact how we see these tools being used and playing out in the coming period.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's really fascinating. You started off and it was getting fairly scary there, Tamer, but then the multilateral issue does bring in this question of whether or not, the question of engagement with China. So Thomas, why don't we turn to you? What movement, if any, do you see in the PRC administration? Are the sides just hardening? Do you think that they're retreating to their corners, ready to come out swinging? Or do you think that China is actually looking for some kind of reconciliation with the US? And that's question number one. I suppose question number two is, to what extent do you think China believes that it needs good relations with the US? Is it comfortable with kind of where they are now? Thomas, over to you.
Right. Thank you, Duncan. From China's perspective, when we look back at the past 12 months, I think China believes that they have done all they could in addressing U.S. concerns. They have repeatedly said in the open that there is no intention on the part of China to replace U.S. as the world power. More than once, I think China has said that. The door of dialogue and the door to collaboration is still open. If you remember in the news, I think last week, I think there is still indication from the central government high-ranking officials when I believe it was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wang. When Wang was asked by the reporters as to whether there's likelihood that there's to be a dialogue between China and U.S., he said yes, but then based on equal footing and on mutual respect. So I think China's position is that there is always room to talk, to kind of resolve any differences that there are. And China has named its price. China has stated many times that they are willing to talk, but obviously based on a mutual respect ground and not being kind of subject to any sanction or subject to any threat in such a way that they're being forced to the negotiation table. That is not the way that China would be prepared to talk. And China also stated its red line, so to speak, within quote, which is that it means that what is important to China, areas where there can be no concession made, is territorial integrity, and also the question of non-interference into China's internal affairs, specifically in the context of Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. As you can see, over the past months, China has consistently objected to foreign criticism or sanctions imposed on the Chinese government or Chinese companies based on allegation of human rights, allegation of breach of human rights, breach of democracy, pace of democracy, and forced labor claims. Consistently trying to deny that, and China feels that that is only a way to put pressure on China. So those are the red line that I think China will make no concession. But as long as that red line is not crossed, I think China's position is clear that there is still room for cooperation, not just with the U.S., but with any other countries in the West. And from China's perspective, insofar as the possibility of working with U.S. again, I think China is willing to work with the U.S. Because the simple fact is that America is still the number one world power, and in many respects, China knows that U.S. is ahead of China in many areas, and so although China this year China is celebrating the year in which China claims that they have achieved their first 100-year goal, which is solving the poverty problem, as well as bringing China to a certain economic level. But they have mentioned that they have the second 100-year goal, which is to achieve the status of national, modernized, socialist, strong country by the year 2049. That is the other 100 year from 1949. So China realized that China cannot do it alone. China needs help from other countries, either from technological know-how and other investment and economic activities that would help China achieve the second goal. And China knows that if there are any chances that it can work with U.S. in order to help China to achieve that goal, they are very willing to further cooperate. But then I think at the moment, China stated the red line, so to speak, and as long as the red line is not crossed, I think there is still room, and China is still willing to work with the U.S.
Yeah, Thomas, that's incredibly clear. I've never heard it put that clearly, and that's brilliant. I think this idea of not interfering with internal affairs, you kind of hear it, but you don't really understand possibly how much it means and how important it is. And you and I are both in Hong Kong, and we know that over the last couple of years, Hong Kong has been on the front page of global newspapers in a way which nobody in Hong Kong really wants to be. We've become a bit of a political football, and one person's political capital in Washington can become interference with. It can be perceived when you're looking for a different window as interference in internal affairs. And I think that's probably the biggest stumbling block. But why don't we pivot slightly and look at some of how this impacts business? Because there's now quite a bit of kind of black letter legislation on the books in relation to sanctions and blocking and all this sort of stuff. And you get individuals and companies being designated as being bad companies and implications flowing from that. But what's really happening here? What do we see our clients struggling with? What are they struggling to implement? Because it looks from a kind of somebody who's not in the flow here as if trade is still happening, money is still flowing. But are there real issues here, or are we just fighting shadows? Tamer, why don't you start with this one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Duncan. So I do think there are real and complex issues here, and they're only getting more complicated. I mean, you mentioned Hong Kong and the situation with Hong Kong, and setting aside the political sensitivities, there was certainly a lot of concern in Hong Kong over the over the U.S. sanctions measures targeting that country. Obviously, there have been a number of individuals that have been designated, but a key concern was, the threat of sanctions against foreign financial institutions and the provisions in the U.S. sanctions law around that. And as we've seen in the mandated State Department and Treasury Department reports, which essentially where Congress required the identification of financial institutions that provide support and facilitate significant transactions with those designated parties, no one's identified in those reports, and that really is a good indication of the complex political as well as economic dynamic here. So we haven't seen the hammer fall, so to speak, on the most significant possible sanctions under that framework, and that's not particularly surprising because of the potential political impact or economic impact. I think it's a good indication of where there are different forces at play, and in that scenario, we had the Treasury Department probably mitigating some of the instincts of other actors in the Trump administration. But I think it would be a mistake to look at that and say there's nothing real happening here, because Hong Kong has certain issues. Mainland China has very different issues from the U.S. Perspective. And certainly, while we've seen examples of what could be considered posturing or viewed as posturing by both countries, as well as some instances of self-restraint, there's no question that we've seen in the last few years significant impacts on trade involving major companies that have been designated, and particularly major mainland Chinese economic actors. I think if you step back and consider, many of the people on this call will be familiar, just to take a couple of examples from the headlines, the issues that have impacted Huawei have resulted in significant changes in that company's supply chains, impacts on its dealings with third country companies that have a tie to the U.S. and also feel perhaps like they're political football. If you look at outside of the China context, many people will be familiar with when the U.S. designated certain Russian oligarchs. There was a huge impact on aluminum markets, commodities markets, securities markets, touching on Rusal, a major company that was impacted by that. And when the U.S. designated Costco Shipping or one of its affiliates, there was a much broader reach into shipping markets because of the impact of economic impact that company had. So the point is that these are tools that have a really significant inherent impact, and that's not going to change anytime soon, and the willingness to use them won't change anytime soon. So I think it's fair to say that we're in the midst of a major shift in how these two countries deal with each other. The U.S. remains very intertwined with the Chinese economy. China remains very intertwined with the U.S. economy. And both countries are going to evaluate when it comes to potential action, what the real impacts are going to be before taking action. But we will continue to see complex challenges for companies in this area. And I would just highlight a few practical impacts we're seeing. One is, the potential decoupling and risk management strategies, particularly for companies that have a significant presence in both the U.S. and China. So we're seeing companies at least considering, the impact of supply chains. How do we plan for potentially significant impacts on our supply chains? Should we shift? In what ways should we shift? And so there's a real risk management exercise. And in some cases, some companies are fundamentally changing. They may be looking at options of preserving their Chinese supply chain, but essentially having a entirely separate supply chain for their U.S. market. Others are taking a different route because of their potential risk profile. We're seeing emerging conflict of law issues, particularly with the Chinese anti-foreign sanctions law that I think Thomas can speak to. There are real issues there that create uncertainty and challenges for companies on the horizon. We're seeing a change in the nature of third-party due diligence for both diversion and supply chain issues because of the kinds of designations that the U.S. is making and the signals that it's sending with those designations. So it's not just China per se, but ties to North Korea. There's a significant focus on that. And there is a significant focus right now within the U.S. administration on ties between civilian entities in China and the military establishment. And so the kinds of due diligence that our clients are doing are really changing. And then finally, when we're looking at recent enforcement matters, number of matters highlighting M&A and successor liability in this space are only putting a premium on the risk profile when it comes to China-related acquisitions, particularly those involving the tech space.
Okay, well that's slightly scarier than I was anticipating. Thomas, what are you seeing through the kind of China window?
Well, I agree with Tamer's observation. When we look at the measures taken by China vis-a-vis the sanctions or the other type of discriminatory or restrictive measures imposed by countries like US and other European countries, when people start looking at the first time, I think it was in September 2020, when the unreliable entity list mechanism came out, that was an order coming out from the Ministry of Commerce from China. But at that time, it was only that order, and we didn't see any action, follow-up action, real action that put certain foreign entities on that list. Then in January this year, we see the China blocking rules, which specify target measures passed by foreign countries that affect Chinese companies and Chinese individuals doing business with third party, and enable Chinese companies and Chinese individuals who suffer losses as a result of companies complying with those foreign measures to sue in the PRC court. Now again, we see that order, and we didn't see any positive action following up from that, and that was January. And June, we finally see a piece of national legislation that came out from the NPCSC, the anti-foreign sanction law, and this is a piece of national legislation, unlike the blocking rules and also the unreliable entity list, which were only an order, directional order that came out from the Ministry of Commerce. This is a piece of national legislation, again targeting foreign countries' sanction, and as a result, if any Chinese company and Chinese people doing business suffer losses as a result of other companies complying with foreign sanctions, there is a right to sue in the PRC court against those companies. So although the legislation came out, but we haven't yet seen China or the relevant authority, normally I would think is the Ministry of Commerce, doing anything to trigger the countermeasure, because under this piece of legislation, the Ministry of Commerce can issue a list of countermeasures targeting certain foreign sanctions. And once that is done, then the possibility of companies that comply with foreign sanction and cause losses to Chinese companies or Chinese individuals can start to sue. So that is a big thing, but we haven't seen that as yet. And we don't know how long China would hold their gun, as it were, because if you see starting from September 2020, there was a gun, there was a pistol, but there was no ammunition, there was no bullet, and then by January there were bullets, but then the bullets were not yet loaded into the gun, and now the legislation is there. We have a loaded gun. So the final straw, I would say, is whether and if so when China pull that trigger. Because once that happens, I'm afraid companies that have presence in both U.S. and in China would really have to think of a good strategy to basically see how they can manage the risk of being caught between the two. On the one hand, you may be subject to the sanction law in the U.S., and on the other hand, if you comply with that sanction law, you might become targeted under the anti-sanction law and might get sued and might have to pay damages to a lot of companies who suffered losses as a result of business activities being terminated or suspended because of the compliance with the foreign sanction law. So the risk is real, the risk is there, and but at the end of the day, we just have to see how the two countries manage their tension.
Okay. So for those who joined halfway through that, we're not talking about real guns and real bullets here, really, are we? What we're talking about is, I suppose, the guns. The guns are the battle lines, and they're the legislation, and I suppose the bullets would be the court cases, which would be taken against the actual sanction actions, which would be taken against a company. So please don't want to turn this into some sort of war of the worlds situation where everybody's running for the hills. That's not where we are, at least not at the moment. But just one final question, if I may do, and Tim, I'm going to aim this first at you to continue the kind of gun metaphor here. I'm going to aim it at you, and then that's pivot over to Thomas. But I'm just going to be slightly provocative here. I think probably a year ago there was a feeling globally that when we were looking at the respective heads of state, we didn't necessarily have adults in the room. There were some rather bullshit teenagers there. I'd like to think that now we do have adults in the room. And if you agree to that, then I would go the next step further, which says that, okay, so these adults, they're going to sit down, they'll work it out. Yes, there'll be posturing in the background, and there'll be people kind of threatening to draw up legislation and threatening to make court cases. But ultimately, they're adults. They're going to sort this out, aren't they, Tamer? They're going to sort it out. Tell me yes.
Well, that's a good provocative question. I think that there are hawks and I don't know if doves is the right word, in both, maybe realists in both camps, in both the sort of the U.S. and Chinese side here. And what Thomas just pointed to as perhaps an unloaded gun, I referred earlier to some posturing and frameworks being set up. I think the reality is we will continue to see hawks on both sides pushing for tougher action. And I think we will also see moderating forces on both sides really bringing some discipline to bear on what the consequences of those actions might be. I do believe we will continue to see an increased use of these tools. As I tried to emphasize before, I think these tools really have the inherent power to cause a lot of economic impact downstream. With some of those examples that I mentioned, across markets. Those examples touch shipping, aluminum, just commodities markets, securities markets. So these are really powerful national security tools, and I think that the reality is we're going to continue to see them used and used more. But one of the things we are already seeing in this administration, somewhat overtly, frankly, is some redrawing of the lines legally on our side. Some executive orders have been revoked, others have been replaced, to try to ensure that some of the unintended consequences are reined in, to impose some order in how the agencies are thinking about these issues. And I think the U.S. and China will continue to have common interests and common ties that will mitigate kind of worst case scenarios. And it's going to be up to companies really to kind of monitor these issues and to think very, very hard about what their real impacts are looking around the corner.
Right. So that's a very measured response and political response. Well done, Thomas. Have you got any final gems which you'd like to share with our audience? Are you going to tell them all that don't worry, it'll be totally fine?
From watching the Chinese Communist Party's policy movement, and also how they have reached out to other countries over the past few months, Tamer is right. I mean, they are adults. They see sometimes, some of the issues that they need to work together. For example, climate change. I think they met, right? They had a meeting. They kind of managed to sit down and talk about things. Despite having differences on other issues, climate change is one that we have already seen that both U.S. and China is working together. So looking at the two sides, I mean, administration Biden just came on as the president, so he has a few more years in his term. Whereas in China, I think some people are asking this question. Next year, 2022 March, will be the end of the 5-year term of the existing government, including the NPC. So there will be an election and kind of change of guard by next March. Question therefore is, some people ask, will there be a change? Will presidency step down, and we might have another leader which might adopt a different U.S. policy, for example, and which might change the whole dynamic, and because there are people kind of raising question as to whether China has been right in adopting this kind of diplomacy. They call it wild wolf diplomacy. That there were criticism, even online, that China shouldn't behave it like that. But despite that is the way of how the China government, through their diplomats, deliver messages. But I think even if the tone changed, the way how they deliver it changed, the policy probably remain unchanged. The reason is that the presidency term, this originally should be the last term for presidency, because each president should serve no more than 2 terms. But if you remember, in 2018, I think the constitution was changed so that the president can, as long as the president get elected at the end of the 5-year term, the same president can continue with the president post, despite serving a 3rd or the 4th term. So legally and constitutionally, it is still possible for Xi to remain as the president beyond next March. Then you would have seen recent news about the achievement. The government has been telling just Chinese people, that they have what they have achieved over the past 5 years. Poverty, they say that they have resolved the poverty question, and they are very proud of it. They have solved the COVID-19. They managed to contain this, and they have, publicized a few more achievements, the space station, for example, and all that. So the way I see it is that, this is, if you like, delivering their report card to their citizens. And the survey says that, the Chinese people are supportive of presidency and his government. So I don't know, I don't have a crystal ball, but the likelihood is that I think his government presidency would probably still stay because there are still unfinished items for him to lead the party to finish it. So does it mean that both administration will still stay in the same way? I would like to see that the climate change is the first kind of ice-breaking point to enable both parties to come and consider matters which is common to both countries' interests. And second, if both countries' leaders can start thinking of the countries, starting to align their country's interests alongside with the global interests, I think there is more room for China and U.S. to work together on other items. And I'm quite hopeful that might happen.
That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Building trust and finding areas of common interest. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, Tamer, Thomas, we've run out of time. That was fascinating. Thank you both very much indeed for your insights, and thank you also to our audience for tuning in. Just a couple of quick reminders. I've mentioned them before, but I'll mention them again. That there is a link to the recording of today's call, and that's available as a podcast on whatever podcast platform you may use. And also, if you have any questions, please email them to gfm@mayorbrown.com, and we will respond to them as quickly as we possibly can do. Thank you so much to all of you for your participation. I hope you found it as interesting as I did, and you may all now disconnect.